You want to buy the garbage, kid? You're a driver, not a salesman. Nobody buys garbage. Imagine hearing that, knowing that every single night truck up to a massive dirt trench and dumping nearly 2 tons of rejected flowers in the ground. Broken stems, bruised petals, slight imperfections. The agricultural operation paid a commercial hauler a fortune to take it off their hands, and the teenager driving the dump truck was at the absolute bottom of the payroll. But fast forward a year and a half, and high-end fashion designers in a major fashion district were literally on a waiting list, begging to get their hands on that exact same trash. So, what did a 9-10-year-old kid see out in that dirt pit that entire industry had missed for 40 years? A journalist was sitting across his kitchen table, mindlessly clicking her pen without realizing it. She was there about a photograph that had blown up in a trade magazine early that year. A picture of hands stained the deep, rich color of a bruised plum, holding a length of cotton fabric dyed a shade that no commercial chemical plant in the state could replicate. She wanted to know how a teenager hauling green waste at midnight ended up shipping steel drums of premium extract to coastal design houses. He told her it all started with a plastic bucket of dead flowers. That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough to make her stop writing for a second, which let him know it was the perfect place to start the story. The massive floral operation sat on hundreds of acres of prime rural bottomland, and it ran on a brutal, unspoken arithmetic. Flowers were pulled from the earth by the tens of thousands. Buyers demanded perfectly straight stems, tight heads, and colors that exactly matched their catalogs. Everything else went straight into gray plastic bins at the end of the grading line. A kinked neck, a split bay too early. It all got tossed, and those bins went on the kid's truck. He worked the night shift because nobody with any seniority wanted it. Every night at 10 p.m., he'd back his rig up to the lip of a trench that had been dug and re-dug for decades, hit the hydraulics, and watch 2 tons of inventory slide in the dark. It smells tea. By late summer, it smelled like entirely. Sigh. Every so often, the company paid a guy from the next town over to churn it in the earth with a loader. That was the entire life cycle for a massive chunk of everything those fields produce. Sitting in the idling truck, he'd run the numbers. Even if a single stem was only worth a nickel, dumping tens of thousands of them meant he was pouring thousands of dollars in the dirt every single night. Technically, the math was flawed. Broken flowers were worth nothing. That was the whole point of the whole. But he thought about it a lot more than a waste disposal driver probably should have. He lived in a cramped, rented house with his mom. She worked days at a local pharmacy counter and spent her nights doing nothing, mostly because she had absolutely nothing left in the tank. They were in the thick of a heavy grief, having just buried his grandma a month and a half prior. His grandma had worked the cutting and grading line at that same flower farm for 31 years. She was an absolute legend out there. She could strip a stem faster than any machine with less damage and had a completely intuitive understanding of exactly when to harvest. The farm gave her a cheap corporate plaque when she hit 25 years, which she kept shoved in a drawer with old rubber bands. But the real mark the job left was on her hands. They were permanently stained, not with dirt, because dirt washes off. Her hands carried a rusty brown color that settled deep in the creases of her knuckles, fading to a faint yellow on the weekends, only to come back darker by Tuesday. When he was little, she told him it was just dirt. When he got older, he stopped asking. The way you stop asking when an adult gives you the same rehearsed answer twice. She also had a quiet ritual. Back at her own house, a place with a sprawling garden that she ruled like a tiny kingdom. She'd take a 5-gallon bucket out in the evenings. She'd gather up all the broken, ugly flowers that would never make it into a vase and carry them out behind her shed. As a kid, he never paid attention to what happened next because it was boring and the TV was on. She had left that house to his mom, but 6 weeks after the funeral, neither of them had been able to step foot inside. So they stayed in their rental, pretending the arrangement was perfectly normal. Yet, somehow, he found him unconsciously carrying on her ritual. Every night before dump his truck, he'd fill a pail with whatever was sitting on top of the discard pile and leave it outside his back door. It wasn't a master plan. It was just a quiet, irrational way of keeping a ghost around. Then the farm called. Management want his grandmother's old locker cleaned out to make space in the equipment shed. His mom couldn't face it. So a few weeks later, he went on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the facility was completely dead. He found exactly what you'd expect: worn-out cotton gloves and a windbreaker and a photo box. But as he was getting ready to leave, he noticed a cabinet door slight ajar on the workbench. It was an area she had unofficially claimed as her own over the decades. Tucked away beneath some petrified sacks of old feed, he found a cracked, cloth-bound ledger. It had her maiden initials, stamped in faded gold on the cover. Sitting on an upturned crate, he opened it. The first 40 pages were just a depressing log of her hour and wages, tracking agonizingly small pay bumps over 31 years. But then the column stopped, and the handwriting completely shifted. It was faster, smaller, the kind of writing you do late at night by a dim lamp so you don't wake the house. It was a recipe. It listed measurements for chemical fixatives, boiling times, and notes about how a specific flower produced a color that held fast to cotton. He checked the date. It was from 24 years before she ever took the job at the farm. He turned the page. There were lists of natural dye recipes dating back to the early 70s, cataloging the exact same waste products the farm was currently throwing away every night. Beside one entry, she'd written, "Holds beautifully. Don't forget this one." He sat in the doorway of the shed, reading that line over and over. She wasn't just taking notes. She was leaving breadcrumbs. The entry tinned out over the 80s, followed by a depressing stretch of blank pages. But near the very back, dated just 11 months before she died, the writing returned in a different pen. A note about a rust, brown dye taking more time than she had left in her anymore. Pinned to the inside back cover was a single note card with 3 rigid rules: 40 minutes, no aluminum, no petals. A week later, the hammer dropped. The new operations manager gathered the shift workers and casually announced that due to environmental runoff regulations, the pit was being permanently capped. They'd signed a contract with a regional waste hub to haul the bins away in commercial trucks 3 nights a week. And just like that, the kid's driving route was eliminated. He had a month left on the payroll before he was out of a job. As effective a way, he heard him speaking before he even thought it through. He offered to buy the waste, to pay for it by the ton if they wanted to weigh it. The manager just looked at him with a mix of pity and amusement. "You're a driver. You're not a salesman. Nobody buys garbage. Take the month, get your final check, and go apply at the warehouse in the next town over." That night, sitting at the edge of the pit, he had a choice. Take the safe warehouse job, put the ledger in a closet, and move on. Or try to decode a notebook he barely understood. Use a material everyone agreed was completely worthless, all before his time ran out. He climbed in the truck bed, filled 2 heavy pails, and only then pulled the lever to dump the rest in the dark. He started his experiments, used a dented aluminum stock pot his mom kept around for canning, boiling water on an outdoor propane burner. He read the ledger by the glow of his phone. It was full of jargon he had to research, requiring chemical binders. He eventually tracked down in the grocery store aisle. He boiled a massive pot of random, whole flowers, tossed in a scrap of fabric, and waited exactly 40 minutes like the pin card said. When he pulled it out under the harsh porch light, it was a terrible, flat, traffic cone orange. By morning, it had faded to a muddy gray. Total failure. Night after night, he kept trying. Word got out at the farm, and the guys on the loading dock started openly mocking him, calling out fake auction prices as he carried his buckets to his car. At home, it was worse. His mom hit her breaking point with the noxious swamp smells and the wasted propane. She cornered him and told him he wasn't trying to build a business. He was just obsessing over his dead grandmother. She went to her room and shut the door, leaving him to realize she was mostly right. He even severely burned his arm when a pot slipped, leaving a scar he'd carry for years. The real breakthrough wasn't a moment of genius. It was basic reading comprehension. He realized he had been blatantly ignored all 3 rules on that pinned card. He was boiling the water hard instead of simmering it. He was using a dented aluminum pot instead of steel, which the book warned would ruin the color. And he was throwing in whole flowers instead of painstakingly stripping them down to just the stems. He scrounged up a cheap stainless steel pot from a thrift store. He spent an hour and a half stripping vegetation by hand until his fingers were stained green. He hovered over the flame, meticulously keeping the water at a gentle tremble for exactly 40 minutes. The next morning, he checked the fabric. It wasn't just as dyed. It was strands of warm, complex, living gold that shifted beautifully in the light. It looked like an antique photograph. He aggressively washed it with heavy dish soap. The color didn't budge. Standing in his driveway at dawn, he suddenly realized his grandmother hadn't been doing some quaint arts and crafts hobby. She had engineered something incredible. He reached out to a boutique textile studio owner in the state capital and drove up to show her his swatches. She took one look, ran a fingernail over the weave, and was blown away. She told him that getting natural dye to hold on cotton like that was notoriously difficult. She immediately ordered 40 yards for an upcoming collection and offered him $400 on the spot. Driving home, reality set in. 40 yards was a massive undertaking for a single thrift, store pot. It meant endless hours of prep and boiling, but the real bottleneck was the chemical fixative stage. The ledger stated the fabric had to soak in a mordant bath overnight, explicitly warning that cotton was stubborn and would lie to you for the first couple of washes. But he only had days left before he lost access to the farm's raw material entirely. So he compromised. He cut the soaking time down from 12 hours to 8, then to 6. The fabric looked absolutely perfect when it came out. He did a quick hand wash, it held, and he boxed it all up and shipped it off right before his final shifts at the farm. A few days later, the studio owner called. The fabric had completely washed out in a standard machine cycle, turning the water into muddy tea. She was incredibly professional about it, which somehow made it hurt more. She was sending the ruined bulk order back and taking a loss. But before hanging up, she noted that his original swatches had held perfectly. She knew he had the secret, but whatever he changed for the bulk order had ruined it. Devastated, he went back to Ledger. He found a crossed-out recipe from decades past with a frustrated note penciled next to it. It was the exact same failure. His grandmother had made the same mistake, rushing the chemical process to meet a demand. She had literally left him a map of the landmines, and he had sprinted right over them just to hit a deadline. Things rapidly got worse. Management at the farm got wind that he was shipping boxes of product out of state. They hauled him into the office and essentially fired him on the spot, citing a clause in his employment contract. Technically, all waste on the property belonged to the company until the commercial haulers took it away. They accused him of stealing company assets. Further, they informed him the new 3-year disposal contract was officially locked in. He was permanently cut off from the only consistent, large-scale source of raw material in the region. He had nothing, no material, no job, a failed major order, and a notebook full of ghost stories. Digging deeper into the ledger that night, he found an ancient, brittle receipt glued near the binding. It was from a wholesale supply house down south, dated back in the 70s, for a small dye lot sale. A scribbled note beside it mentioned the buyer's wife. He called his aunt, who reluctantly confirmed that before taking the factory job, his grandmother used to sell incredible dye batches to a traveling buyer for cash. She kept it a total secret because she knew if the agricultural giants ever found out, they'd find a way to claim it. Then, a massive threat materialized. The textile studio owner in the capital had his successful swatch pinned to her board. A major buyer from the coast saw them, immediately drove out to the flower farm, and demanded to speak to whoever was running their natural dye program. The operations manager, smelling a massive opportunity, gave her a tour and bold claimed the company was developing the product in-house using their own byproduct stream. Days later, the kid got a formal legal threat from the company's lawyers. They demanded the immediate return of the ledger, claiming it was company property since it was found in their shed and created by their employee. They explicitly reserved all rights to commercialize the process. Legally, they had a terrifyingly strong case. They were going to legally steal her life's work, mass produce it, and erase her name from the story completely. Desperate, he tracked down the historical society in the town where the old supply house used to be. A volunteer connected him with the original buyer's daughter. He drove across state lines to meet her. She told him the true story of that ancient receipt. His grandma hadn't been canceled on by the buyer. She had pulled the plug herself. When a batch of cotton didn't hold up to her uncompromising standards, she refused to ship it, choosing to lose the account rather than put her name on a flawed product. Crucially, the daughter still had the apology letter her father had kept. It was typed on personal stationery, signed with his grandmother's full name, and dated more than a decade before she ever stepped foot on the commercial farm. Stapled to the back was a perfectly preserved 4-year-old fabric swatch. The color hadn't faded to a single degree. It was undeniable physical proof of prior invention. Driving back, he put the final puzzle pieces together. He remembered the disposal paperwork pinned to the warehouse bulletin board. The farm was paying the commercial waste hauler by the ton. There was no minimum volume required in the contract. He didn't hire a lawyer. He walked straight in the operations manager's office. He laid out the 4-year-old letter and the flawless swatch, completely vaporizing their legal claim to the intellectual property. Then he laid out his own failed modern swatch to show how easy the process could crash and burn in amateur hands. Finally, he offered a brutally simple business deal. He would haul the waste away using his own equipment and insurance. It would instantly wipe out a massive bleeding line item on the company's expense sheet. In exchange, he want exclusive rights to the material and a cut of the retail profits. But his absolute non-negotiable condition was that the final product would legally bear his grandmother's name. The ledgers stayed with his family forever, and the lawyers backed off immediately. He didn't beg for fairness. He just used basic arithmetic to make saying, yes, the most profitable option for the farm. The manager signed. The business shortly after. That major coastal designer came back because the kid had the three things no one else in the industry possessed: an exclusive raw supply chain, a verified 4-decade track record of color stability stapled to a piece of paper, and a real, authentic human story. He moved the operation in his grandmother's empty house, finally breathing life back into it. His mom quit the pharmacy to run the books. One of the veteran line workers from the farm came over to manage the massive steel vats. He even perfected the elusive, moody purple dye by letting the iron chemical baths sit long and strict necessary. He sent the original studio owner a flawless replacement batch, and she became a loyal, permanent client. The reporter, sitting in the kitchen, was captivated. She looked out the window and asked about the random plastic bucket sitting empty by the workshop door. He told her it never actually gets boiled. It just gets filled every single night and sits there to remind him to pay attention to what people throw away. The truth is, nobody hands you the thing that saves you. It usually looks exactly like garbage, sitting in a drawer or at the bottom of a dirt pit. The only thing that matters is if you're paying attention when you walk past it. The kid didn't invent the formula, and he didn't have investors or mentors cheer him on. He just had a stubborn refusal to believe that 2 tons of anything could be entirely devoid of value. He failed spectacularly when he chased a quick paycheck instead of respecting the process. And that massive failure was the exact tuition he needed to understand the genius of the rules left behind for him. And when it came time to fight the corporate machine, he didn't whine about justice. He just built an undeniable case based on leverage. So, take a second to think about this in your own life. What is your dirt pit? What is that one skill you've written off, that old project gathering dust, or that tedious part of your industry that everyone ignores? Sometimes, the thing that completely alters the trajectory of your life isn't out there waiting to be discovered. It's the thing you've been walking past every single day because someone told you a long time ago that it didn't matter. If you know some grind away on something the world thinks is a complete waste of time, send this their way. Sometimes, just knowing one person sees the value is all the leverage they need to keep going.